The sodium vapor lamps cast a sickly yellow glow over Reynolds Road, painting the asphalt in streaks of light and shadow. It was late, the kind of late that settled into the bones, a damp chill creeping into the air despite the summer month. Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace gripped the steering wheel of the government-issued sedan, the hum of the engine a low thrum against the silence. She was tired, the long drive from the base pulling at her, a dull ache behind her eyes. Just a few more miles. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights strobed in her rearview mirror, cutting through the quiet. Adrienne's stomach tightened, a knot of irritation forming. A traffic stop? Now. She pulled over, her mind already racing, evaluating the situation. Had she been speeding? She was meticulous about following traffic laws, especially in a government vehicle. The officer approached, his silhouette a dark shape against the harsh lights. He rapped sharply on her window, the sound startling her. Adrienne lowered the window, the cool night air a stark contrast to the stuffy interior of the car. The beam of a flashlight hit her directly in the face, momentarily blinding her. "License and registration," the officer barked, his voice edged with an abrasive authority. Adrienne blinked, momentarily disoriented. She felt a flicker of annoyance, a small spark of defiance igniting within her. This felt excessive. "Officer," she said, her voice calm, and even despite the surge of irritation, "may I ask why I'm being stopped?" Internally, she was already cataloging the details: the officer's badge number, the time, the precise location. Years of military training had ingrained a meticulous awareness of her surroundings. "You were drifting between lanes," the officer said, his tone accusatory. "Looked like you might have been under the influence." He leaned closer, peering into the car. Adrienne could smell stale coffee and something faintly metallic on his breath. "That's a government vehicle," Adrienne replied, producing her military ID along with her license and registration. "I'm a federal employee." She held the ID slightly higher, ensuring it was clearly visible in the flashlight beam. She was tired, yes, but certainly not intoxicated. The insinuation chafed. The officer snatched the documents, his gaze flicking between the ID and her face. A flicker of something uncertainty, perhaps, crossed his features, but it was quickly replaced by a mask of practiced indifference. "Doesn't mean you're above the law," he retorted, his voice still laced with that grating arrogance. Adrienne took a slow, measured breath, her control unwavering. This was familiar territory, a different battlefield, but the principles of engagement were the same. Maintain composure. Assess the situation. Respond strategically. "Just so we're clear," she said, her voice steady, her hand discreetly activating the camera on her phone. "This interaction is being documented." The officer's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He clearly hadn't anticipated this. The shift in power was almost palpable. Adrienne held his gaze, her expression unreadable. The small red light blinking on her phone, a silent witness, was a subtle but significant recalibration of the balance. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken tension. The officer, Sergeant Daniel Mercer, felt a prickle of unease. Something about this woman's unwavering gaze unnerved him. Her calmness, her composure was unsettling. He'd expected fear, subservience, the usual cocktail of emotions he encountered during these late-night stops. Instead, he was met with a quiet strength that felt almost challenging. He glanced at the phone in her hand, the small red light a sudden, unwelcome intrusion. Damn it! He retreated to his patrol car, the crisp rustle of his uniform against the car door echoing in the night. He radioed dispatch, requesting a check on the vehicle registration and the driver's identification. He needed confirmation, reassurance that his gut feeling was wrong. His fingers drummed impatiently against the steering wheel. Dispatch to Unit 27, vehicle registered to the U.S. Department of Defense. Driver confirmed as Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace, United States Army. The voice crackled through the radio, the words hitting Mercer like a punch to the gut. "Lieutenant Colonel?" "Shit." Officer Diaz, his partner for the night, turned to him, her brow furrowed. "Lieutenant Colonel, she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Dan, are you sure about this? Mercer swallowed hard, the arrogance that had been so readily apparent just moments ago dissolving into a cold sweat of apprehension. He knew he'd overstepped. He'd let his usual bravado, his ingrained sense of authority, blind him. He glanced back at the government sedan, the figure of Lieutenant Colonel Wallace still visible in the dim light. She sat motionless, a silent, imposing presence. He returned to Wallace's car, the bravado replaced by a forced civility. "Ma'am," he began, his voice strained, "I apologize for the inconvenience. There seems to be a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Wallace's expression remained unchanged, her gaze steady. "Thank you, officer," she replied, her voice even. She waited until he had retreated back to his patrol car before starting her engine and pulling back onto Reynolds Road, the taillights of the police cruiser receding in her rearview mirror. The knot of irritation hadn't completely dissipated, replaced now by a quiet resolve. This wasn't over. The encounter replayed in Adrienne's mind as she drove the rest of the way to her temporary lodging. Mercer's initial aggression, the casual disregard for her position, the palpable shift in his demeanor after the radio call, each detail etched itself into her memory. She had encountered this kind of power play before, not always directed at her, but at others who lacked the rank or the platform to push back. This time, it was different. This time, she wouldn't let it slide. The next morning, Adrienne contacted Delaney Price, a lawyer known for her tenacity and her unwavering commitment to justice. Delaney listened intently, her expression hardening as Adrienne recounted the events of the previous night. "Don't worry, Adrienne," Delaney said, her voice firm. "We'll make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." The wheels were set in motion. A formal complaint was filed. The video footage from Adrienne's phone became a key piece of evidence. Officer Diaz, troubled by Mercer's behavior, came forward with corroborating testimony. The incident, initially dismissed as a routine traffic stop, escalated into a civil rights trial, exposing a pattern of misconduct and abuse of authority by Sergeant Mercer. Captain Dan Reading, Mercer's superior, finally confronted him, the weight of the accusations heavy in the air. "Daniel," he said, his voice weary, "you've been on the force for a long time. You know better than this." Mercer sat silently, his gaze fixed on the floor, the consequences of his actions finally sinking in. He knew his career, his reputation, everything he had built was crumbling around him. The trial concluded with a verdict in favor of Lieutenant Colonel Wallace. It was a small victory, but a significant one. It was a victory not just for Adrienne, but for all those who had been silenced, intimidated, and unjustly treated by those in positions of power. Weeks later, Adrienne stood before a group of newly commissioned military officers, their faces bright with anticipation. "Leadership," she began, her voice resonating with authority and conviction, "is not about wielding power, but about upholding integrity. It's about accountability, about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the young faces before her. "Never forget," she continued, her voice firm, "that true strength lies not in the uniform you wear, but in the character you cultivate." The stale coffee smell clung to the Toledo police station like a second skin, a familiar, almost comforting scent in the bleak, fluorescent light. Daniel Mercer leaned back in his chair, the worn leather groaning under his weight. He spun a pen between his fingers, a nervous habit he hadn't realized he'd picked up until just now. "So, I had this little spat with a driver the other day," he started, addressing Officer Diaz, his voice laced with the casual indifference he usually reserved for recounting parking violations. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Inside, though, a flicker of unease danced around the edges of his confidence. Something about the woman's steady gaze, the unwavering calm in her voice, had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Diaz, younger, fresher-faced, and still carrying the idealism that Mercer had long shed like a winter coat, looked up from the stack of paperwork that seemed to perpetually occupy her desk. "Spat? What happened?" "Typical stuff." Mercer waved a dismissive hand, the gold of his badge catching the light. He relished the weight of it, the symbol of his authority. It was a shield, a weapon, a guarantee of respect, or at least compliance. Tail light out. Woman gave me attitude. He paused, replaying the scene in his head. Her face, though it was familiar. He pushed the thought away. It was nothing. He saw hundreds of faces every week. Kept arguing about the ticket. Tried to pull rank on me. He chuckled again, the sound hollow even to his own ears. The woman hadn't yelled, hadn't even raised her voice. Her composure had been unsettling, like she knew something he didn't. Diaz frowned. Pull rank? What do you mean? She leaned forward, her brow furrowing with curiosity. The pen in Mercer's hand stilled. He hadn't thought about it much, hadn't wanted to think about it. The way she held herself, the quiet authority in her voice, it had prickled at him, a subtle challenge to his dominance. He shrugged, said something about being a lieutenant or something. Military, like that mattered on my beat. He saw Diaz's expression shift, a subtle tightening around her eyes. He felt a prickle of annoyance. Why did she look like that? Like he'd missed something important. Like he'd made a mistake. He hated that look. A lieutenant? Diaz's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. She swiveled her chair, fingers flying across her keyboard. The rhythmic tapping filled the silence. Each click a tiny hammer blow against the fragile wall of Mercer's bravado. He watched her, a growing unease settling in his gut. What was she doing? He knew that look. The look of someone who had unearthed something unexpected, something significant. He swallowed hard, the metallic tang of fear rising in his throat. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Mercer shifted in his chair, the worn leather suddenly uncomfortable. He could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights, the muffled chatter from the dispatch office, the rhythmic click of Diaz's keyboard. Each sound seemed amplified, each second an eternity. He wanted to say something, to break the tension, but the words caught in his throat. A cold dread began to seep into his bones. Diaz stopped typing, her eyes fixed on the computer screen. She slowly turned back to Mercer, her expression unreadable. Lieutenant Colonel, she corrected, her voice low and even. Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace. Runs logistics out of Fort Wayne. 2 deployments, Bronze Star, Legion of Merit. She sledged it. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mercer stared at her, his mind reeling. Lieutenant Colonel. 2 deployments. Bronze Star. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture that made his stomach churn. The quiet authority, the unwavering gaze, the familiar face he'd seen her picture in the local paper, commending her service. He just hadn't connected the dots. He'd been so focused on asserting his own authority that he'd been blind to hers. A wave of nausea washed over him. He'd harassed a highly decorated lieutenant colonel over a broken taillight. His mind raced, frantically searching for a way out, a way to minimize the damage. He could claim he hadn't known. He could say it was a misunderstanding. But the woman had shown him her military ID. He dismissed it, belittled it, waved it away like it was nothing. He remembered the flash of her phone, the unwavering gaze as she recorded the entire interaction. He'd scoffed, thinking she was bluffing. Now, the memory sent a chill down his spine. Diaz's voice, soft but firm, broke through his panicked thoughts. She filed a formal complaint, Sergeant. The words landed like a punch to the gut. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He could feel the blood draining from his face, the room tilting slightly. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. Internal affairs is already involved. Diaz continued, her voice laced with a mixture of pity and something else, disappointment. Captain Reading wants to see you. The name of his superior officer echoed in his ears, a death knell to his carefully constructed world of power and impunity. He looked at Diaz, her expression a mirror reflecting his own fear. He wanted to deny everything, to rage, to blame the woman, to blame anyone but himself. But the words wouldn't come. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was over. The shield he had wielded so carelessly had finally cracked, and the consequences were about to come crashing down. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. He felt the weight of his badge, no longer a symbol of power, but a heavy chain dragging him down. He walked towards Captain Reading's office, each step a slow, agonizing march towards the inevitable. The stale coffee smell, once familiar and comforting, now seemed to suffocate him, a constant reminder of the crumbling world he had built on the foundation of his own arrogance. The crisp autumn air, scented with the dry rustle of fallen leaves, drifted into Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace's office. Sunlight, filtered through the blinds, cast stripes across her polished desk, illuminating the neatly arranged files and the framed commendation hanging on the wall. She watched the digital clock tick, each second a measured beat in the silence. Her fingers, long and slender, tapped a rhythmic pattern against the cool metal of her phone. The video file, small but potent, sat within, a silent testament to the simmering anger she had kept tightly leashed. This isn't just about a traffic stop. She thought, the familiar weight of responsibility settling in her chest. It's about principle. It was about every soldier under her command, about the expectation of justice, about the very fabric of their shared oath. The memory of Sergeant Mercer's sneering face, the casual disregard in his voice, was a bitter taste on her tongue. She opened the email, the cursor blinking expectantly in the subject line. Typing slowly, deliberately, she wrote, "Formal Complaint Incident Report FW 2023-10-27A." Each keystroke felt like a small victory, a step towards dismantling the wall of impunity she had encountered. Doubts, fleeting and insignificant, pricked at her. Was she overreacting? Making a mountain out of a molehill? She dismissed the thought. This wasn't about her ego, about bruised pride. This was about something larger. She attached the video file and addressed the email to both the Internal Affairs Department of the Toledo Police Department and the Inspector General's office. Hitting send felt like exhaling after a long, held breath. The relief, however, was tempered by a cold certainty that this was only the beginning. I'm not looking for headlines. She reminded herself, the echo of her own words firm in her mind. I'm looking for accountability. Across the state lines, in Toledo, Sergeant Daniel Mercer was oblivious to the gathering storm. He sat in his patrol car, the radio crackling with static, the familiar hum of the engine a comforting rhythm in the mundane monotony of his shift. He'd pulled over a teenager for a broken taillight, the boy's nervousness palpable in the tremor of his hands as he fumbled for his license and registration. Mercer felt a flicker of satisfaction, the familiar surge of power. He relished these moments, the small displays of authority, the implicit deference to his badge. He never considered the possibility that this power could be challenged, let alone stripped away. The days that followed were a blur of routine for Mercer. Traffic stops, minor disputes, the occasional drunken brawl outside a downtown bar. The system had always protected him, shielded him from the consequences of his actions. He'd learned to play the game, to navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth, to make problems disappear. The whispers about his methods, the hushed complaints, never amounted to anything. He was untouchable, a fixture in the precinct, his seniority a shield against scrutiny. Within the confines of Fort Wayne, however, the wheels of justice were slowly beginning to turn. Wallace's complaint had landed on the desk of Captain Dan Reading, Mercer's superior. Reading, a man weathered by years on the force, watched the video with a growing sense of unease. He'd heard the rumors about Mercer, the whispers of excessive force, the veiled accusations of intimidation, but he'd always dismissed them as the disgruntled ramblings of those on the wrong side of the law. The video, however, was undeniable. It was a stark, unflinching portrayal of Mercer's abuse of power. He summoned Officer Diaz, a young, sharp-eyed officer known for her integrity. "Diaz," he began, his voice heavy with a weariness that went beyond the long hours. "Run a background check on a Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace." "Military." Diaz, sensing the gravity of the situation, typed swiftly, her fingers dancing across the keyboard. The results appeared on the screen, a testament to Wallace's impeccable record, her numerous commendations, her high-ranking position. Diaz looked at Reading, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and understanding. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken implications. Reading rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had a problem that wouldn't simply disappear. Meanwhile, Delaney Price, Wallace's lawyer, reviewed the details of the case. A seasoned litigator with a reputation for tenacity, she saw the bigger picture, the potential ramifications of this incident. "This could be a landmark case, Adrienne," she said, her voice calm and assured. "A precedent for holding law enforcement accountable." Wallace listened, her gaze steady, her mind racing. She hadn't anticipated the scale of the potential fallout. She'd simply wanted justice, a simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Now, it seemed, she was at the center of something much larger. The news of the complaint began to circulate within military and legal circles. The story, whispered at first, then spoken aloud, gained momentum. The hushed conversations, the speculative glances, the palpable tension in the air, all spoke to the underlying anxieties about power, accountability, and the fragile balance of justice. Back in Toledo, the storm finally broke. Captain Reading called Mercer into his office, the video playing silently on the computer screen. The flickering images illuminated Mercer's face, revealing the cracks in his carefully constructed facade of indifference. "Explain this, Sergeant," Reading said, his voice devoid of emotion. Mercer opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had no explanations, no justifications, only the sinking realization that the system, for the first time, had failed to protect him. The silence in the room was deafening, punctuated only by the whirring of the computer fan and the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick was a reminder of the time he'd wasted, the power he'd abused, the consequences he could no longer avoid. The walls he'd built around himself, brick by brick, were beginning to crumble. The stale air of the Lucas County Civil Court hung heavy, a tangible weight pressing down on Adrienne. The faint scent of disinfectant warred with the musty odor of old paper and the nervous perspiration of onlookers. Beneath the fluorescent lights, the courtroom felt cold, despite the summer heat simmering outside. She adjusted the crisp lines of her uniform, the weight of the insignia a familiar comfort in this unfamiliar setting. Her heart thrummed a steady rhythm against her ribs, a counterpoint to the chaotic flutter in her stomach. This wasn't a battlefield, but the tension was palpable, a different kind of war waged with words and perceptions. Composure. Adrienne, she reminded herself. Just the facts. Delaney Price, her lawyer, offered a reassuring smile, a silent affirmation of their meticulous preparation. Adrienne returned the gesture, a small twitch of her lips, before turning her attention to the jury box. 13 faces, each a blank slate, their expressions carefully neutral, scrutinizing her. She could feel their collective gaze, dissecting her, assessing her credibility. "They're looking for cracks," a voice whispered in her mind. "Don't give them any." The oath was a formality, words she had uttered countless times in her military career. Yet, here, in this arena of legalities and accusations, they resonated differently. Truth, justice, the very concepts felt fragile, susceptible to manipulation and misinterpretation. Lieutenant Colonel Wallace, Delaney's voice, clear and confident, cut through the courtroom silence. "Can you describe the events of April 12th? Adrienne took a deep breath, steadying herself. The memory was etched into her mind, vivid and sharp. "I was driving home from the base, proceeding southbound on I-75. The words flowed evenly, measured and precise. I was observing the speed limit, driving within the marked lanes. Internally, she replayed the scene, the flashing lights in her rearview mirror, the unexpected jolt of annoyance. A routine traffic stop. How did it escalate so quickly? And what happened next? Sergeant Mercer signaled for me to pull over. I complied. Each word was carefully chosen, stripped of emotion, leaving only the bare bones of the narrative. She could feel Mercer's gaze burning into her from across the room, a simmering resentment barely contained beneath a veneer of forced composure. He thought he could intimidate me. She thought, a flicker of anger igniting within her. He underestimated me. Did you have any interaction with Sergeant Mercer before he asked for your license and registration? Delaney's questions were carefully structured, guiding her testimony, building a solid foundation. Yes, he approached my vehicle and immediately demanded to know where I thought I was going. Adrienne's voice remained steady, devoid of the indignation she had felt in that moment. Contempt dripping from every word, she recalled, the taste of it bitter on her tongue. He expected deference, obedience. He didn't get it. And your response? I informed him that I was driving home, and that his tone was unprofessional, she added silently, that he had no right to address a superior officer in that manner. The courtroom was hushed, the only sound the gentle whir of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of Delaney's pen against her notepad. The tension was a living thing, pulsating in the air. Did you identify yourself as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army? Delaney's voice was soft, yet it carried through the room. Not initially. I wanted to understand the reason for the stop. To gauge his reaction, she thought. To see if his behavior was simply unprofessional or something more sinister. At what point did you inform Sergeant Mercer of your rank? After he continued to question my intentions and implied that I was intoxicated. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. The memory of the accusation stung, even now. The audacity, she thought, her jaw tightening imperceptibly, to question my sobriety, my integrity. And how did Sergeant Mercer react to this information? He dismissed it. Adrienne's voice, though still controlled, held a hint of steel. He scoffed, she remembered, as if my rank, my service meant nothing. She could see Officer Diaz, Mercer's colleague, sitting in the back of the courtroom, her gaze fixed on the floor. She knew, Adrienne thought. She saw it all. Your Honor, Delaney addressed the judge, I'd like to present Exhibit, the video recording from Lieutenant Colonel Wallace's phone. The turning point, the moment of truth. Adrienne watched as the video played on the large screen, the grainy footage capturing the encounter in stark detail. Mercer's arrogance, his dismissive tone, his blatant disregard for her rank, it was all there, undeniable. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of Mercer's voice, amplified and distorted, echoing his own downfall. I was driving within the lines. I was sober. I was not aggressive. There was no safety concern. Adrienne stated, her voice resonating with quiet power. I wanted an accurate record of what happened. Accountability matters, especially for those in positions of authority. Later, after the verdict had been delivered, after the gavel had fallen, after the press had dispersed, Adrienne stood before a new group of recruits, their faces fresh and eager, their uniforms still crisp and new. The courtroom victory was a fleeting triumph. The real battle, she knew, was waged daily, in the small choices, the quiet acts of integrity. This badge, she said, her voice resonating with conviction, holding up her military insignia, isn't a symbol of power, it's a symbol of responsibility. I believe discretion must be paired with discipline. Leadership isn't about wielding authority, it's about earning respect. It's about serving those you lead, not lording over them. Remember that always. The recruits listened intently, their gazes locked on hers, absorbing her words. And in that moment, Adrienne felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps, just perhaps, the system could change, one act of accountability at a time. The fluorescent lights of the Lucas County Civil Court hummed, casting a sterile glow on the polished wood of the witness stand. Daniel Mercer shifted uncomfortably, the crisp collar of his dress uniform chafing against his neck. He could feel the weight of the courtroom's gaze, a tangible pressure that seemed to amplify the erratic thump of his heart. His eyes darted towards the jury box, searching for a flicker of understanding, a hint of empathy in their impassive faces. He found none. They think they know me, he thought bitterly. They think they've seen through me. He tugged at his tie, the knot suddenly feeling like a noose. Delaney Price, Wallace's lawyer, stood before him, her presence radiating a quiet confidence that grated on his nerves. She held his gaze, her eyes sharp and unwavering, like a hawk circling its prey. He'd seen that look before, the look of a predator anticipating the kill. His gut clenched. He'd been so certain, so sure of his authority, but now, doubt gnawed at the edges of his conviction, a creeping unease that he desperately tried to suppress. "Sergeant Mercer," Price's voice, crisp and clear, sliced through the hushed courtroom. "Why did you ask Lieutenant Colonel Wallace to exit the vehicle?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Mercer swallowed hard, the dryness in his throat making it difficult to speak. He'd rehearsed this moment countless times, crafted justifications that sounded plausible, even righteous, in the confines of his own mind. But now, facing the scrutiny of the court, the carefully constructed facade began to crumble. She looked evasive. He finally managed, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. Evasive? What does that even mean? He could hear the echo of Captain Reading's voice in his head, the disappointment laced with barely contained fury. He hadn't just embarrassed himself. He'd tarnished the badge, the entire department. Price's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Evasive, Sergeant? Could you elaborate on what specific behaviors led you to that conclusion?" He floundered, grasping for an explanation that wouldn't sound as flimsy as it felt. He mumbled something about her posture, the way she held her hands, anything to deflect the laser focus of Price's gaze. Each word felt like a lie, a further unraveling of the carefully constructed persona he'd maintained for so long. He could feel the sweat beating on his forehead, the courtroom's oppressive silence amplifying the frantic rhythm of his pulse. He glanced towards the back of the room, hoping to catch Officer Diaz's eye, seeking some semblance of support, some reassurance that he wasn't alone in this. But Diaz's face was carefully neutral, her expression unreadable. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was alone. "So, Sergeant Mercer," Price's voice, smooth as silk, drew him back to the present. "What made you escalate the stop? Why did you insist on detaining a high-ranking military officer for a minor traffic infraction?" The question hung in the air, a silent indictment. He could feel the jury's eyes on him, their collective gaze a tangible weight. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer another carefully crafted justification, but the words wouldn't come. The carefully constructed wall he'd built around himself, the wall of authority and arrogance, was crumbling, brick by brick. "I probably would have handled it differently," he stammered, the words escaping before he could stop them. The courtroom erupted in a low murmur, a collective gasp of disbelief. He'd said it, admitted it, aloud for everyone to hear. The admission hung in the air, a stark confession of his wrongdoing. He closed his eyes, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with crushing force. He'd been so certain, so sure of his power, and now it was all gone. The trial continued, a blur of testimonies and legal arguments, but Mercer barely registered the proceedings. He sat in a daze, numb to the world around him, the echo of his own admission reverberating in his mind. "I probably would have handled it differently." The words were a damning indictment, a testament to his arrogance and his abuse of power. The jury's deliberation felt like an eternity, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against his fragile composure. He could feel the tension in the courtroom, a palpable energy that crackled with anticipation. Finally, the foreman rose, his voice resonating with authority. "In the case of Wallace versus Mercer, we the jury find in favor of the plaintiff, Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace." The words struck him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He stared blankly ahead, unable to process the verdict. The judge read the details, the damages awarded, the declaration of a violation of constitutional rights. But the words were meaningless, a jumble of sounds that failed to penetrate the fog of despair that had settled over him. The gavel fell, a sharp, decisive sound that signaled the end. He rose from the witness stand, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. He could feel the eyes of the courtroom on him, their gazes filled with a mixture of contempt and pity. He avoided their stares, his gaze fixed on the floor, ashamed to meet their eyes. He walked out of the courtroom, a broken man, the weight of his actions finally crushing him beneath its immense weight. The world outside seemed brighter, harsher, the sounds and smells of the city assaulting his senses. He took a deep breath, the cool air burning his lungs, a stark reminder of the reality he could no longer escape. He was no longer Sergeant Mercer, the man of authority, the enforcer of the law. He was simply Daniel Mercer, a man stripped bare, exposed for the world to see. The consequences of his actions had finally caught up with him, and there was nowhere left to hide. The stale air of the courthouse still hung heavy with the lingering scent of anticipation, a stark contrast to the fresh breeze that whipped through the streets outside. News traveled fast. The whispers had started even before the gavel fell, rustling through the rows like dry leaves in autumn. Guilty on 2 counts of abuse of authority. The words echoed, not just in the courtroom, but in the quiet corners of the Toledo Police Department, each syllable a chip at the foundation of Sergeant Daniel Mercer's carefully constructed world. He hadn't expected this. He'd convinced himself, right up until the jury foreman spoke, that his badge, his years of service, would shield him. They hadn't. He felt a coldness creep up his spine, not unlike the chill of a winter night spent on patrol. Only this one came from within, a premonition of the icy isolation to come. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with a strained silence. Every averted glance, every hushed conversation felt like a judgment. Mercer could feel their eyes on him, assessing, dissecting. He imagined them replaying the trial in their minds, the dashcam footage flickering like a ghost on the wall, his own voice, once a symbol of authority, now a damning testament to his arrogance. He remembered Officer Diaz's testimony, her quiet but firm words painting a picture of a department turning a blind eye. A betrayal, he thought, but a necessary one. He'd built his career on the unspoken code, the understanding that power protected its own. He hadn't anticipated the crack, the sliver of doubt that Diaz's words had wedged into the foundation. He'd underestimated the weight of truth, the slow, relentless erosion of the lies he'd told himself and others. Captain Dan Reading's office door loomed before him, the darkwood seeming to absorb the light, a physical manifestation of the darkness closing in. The curt summons had left no room for misinterpretation. Inside, Reading sat behind his desk, the lines on his face deeper than Mercer remembered, his gaze sharp and unwavering. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the ticking of the clock on the wall, each tick a hammer blow against the remnants of Mercer's composure. Sergeant Mercer. Reading's voice was devoid of any warmth, a stark contrast to the jovial camaraderie they'd once shared. Effective immediately, you were suspended pending an internal investigation. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Mercer's mind raced, grasping for a defense, an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. The shield was gone, the illusion of invincibility shattered. All that remained was the cold, hard reality of his actions and the consequences that awaited him. He nodded, a single, curt movement, and turned to leave, the weight of his disgrace pressing down on him, heavier than any badge he'd ever worn. Hundreds of miles away, in her office at Fort Wayne, Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace watched the news report, a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. The victory wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, intimidated, or unjustly treated by those in positions of authority. She thought of the countless times she'd witnessed similar abuses of power, the casual arrogance, the unspoken threat. This time, she'd refused to be silent. The phone recording, a simple act of defiance, had become a catalyst for change, a ripple that had spread wider than she could have imagined. Her lawyer, Delaney Price, had been right. "This isn't just about a traffic stop, Adrienne," Delaney had said, her voice firm. "It's about setting a precedent." The weight of those words settled upon her now, a responsibility that extended far beyond the confines of the courtroom. It wasn't enough to win a battle. She needed to win the war. She had a duty, not just to herself, but to every soldier under her command, to instill in them the principles of leadership, integrity, and the courage to speak truth to power. She looked out the window at the young recruits drilling on the parade ground, their movements sharp and precise, their faces filled with youthful enthusiasm. These were the future leaders, the guardians of the very principles she was fighting to uphold. Later that day, standing before the assembled recruits, Wallace felt a surge of resolve. The setting sun cast long shadows across the parade ground, painting the scene in hues of gold and crimson. Respect isn't something you're owed. It's something you prove every day. Her voice resonated with conviction, carrying across the silent ranks. The badge of rank, the authority, it's not a shield, it's a weight. Lead with character, serve with integrity, and never forget you don't just represent the uniform. You represent every person who came before you and everyone who will come after. She paused, letting her words sink in, watching as the youthful enthusiasm in their eyes slowly gave way to a dawning understanding of the weight of their responsibility. As the last recruit filed out, Wallace lingered on the parade ground, the fading light painting the sky in shades of deep purple and gray. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and the lingering echo of her words. She thought of Mercer, his career in ruins, his authority stripped away. It wasn't a feeling of triumph, but rather a profound sense of sadness. A reminder of the corrosive nature of unchecked power and the importance of holding ourselves accountable, not just to the law, but to the higher principles that define us. The fight for justice wasn't over. It was a constant, ongoing struggle, of vigilance that required courage, integrity, and the unwavering commitment to truth. And in the quiet stillness of the evening, Adrienne Wallace reaffirmed her commitment to that fight, a quiet promise whispered into the gathering darkness.